We have our guest speaker, Professor Kathryn Crameri, who's a prolific publisher in all things to do with Catalonia, including a book this year about Catalonian independence, just published, The Future or No More Leaving Spain. What was the title exactly, Kathryn?
Goodbye Spain.
Goodbye Spain, there it is. Goodbye Spain. And we thought it would be very appropriate to invite Kathryn to here, because unless you were on the planet Zog for the last 2 months, everybody here, I'm sure, will remember there was a referendum in Scotland not that long ago. And everybody was talking about Catalonia as well, so it seems very appropriate to get somebody in who really knows what they're talking about, rather than the rest of us who are coming up with all sorts of stereotypes to look and compare a wee bit the processes in both countries. So, over to you, Kathryn, thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you for the invitation to come and talk today. So yes, indeed, I've been working on Catalonia for the last 20 years, and it's only in the very recent past that has become a trendy thing to do. It's quite nice now not to have to explain to people where Catalonia is and what it's all about, because people know now in a way that they didn't 20 years ago, and that's great. So we used to get it confused with the Basque Country and all sorts of things, and I would spend most of my time explaining why I was even interested in Catalonia, why was it even different from the rest of Spain. And that's not the case now, because people realise that it is different from the rest of Spain, and that there are indeed quite a lot of similarities with what's been happening in Scotland, although a lot of differences as well. So the question that I was asked to talk about is what can Scotland learn from the example of Catalonia? And the answer to that question, of course, depends on what you think should happen next in Scotland. There was an article in, I think it was the Herald a little while ago, with this very similar title to this, where the writer was actually talking about what could Scotland learn from Catalonia in terms of independence. But of course, there is also much to be learned in terms of devolution, further devolution, and the ways that might happen in Scotland. So I'm going to look at both of those examples today. So just a little bit of background before we start properly. Catalonia is what's called an autonomous community within Spain. Spain in the late 70s, early 80s was divided up into 17 autonomous communities. So they have particular powers in many senses, like what the Scottish Parliament has or the Welsh Assembly has, and they are therefore in some ways autonomous from the rest of Spain. However, the Spanish Constitution states that Spain is the only nation and that Spain is indivisible. And this is where the conflict comes from in the current time. So the Constitution says that there is no nation state other than Spain, and that nation state cannot be divided in any way. So the powers of the autonomous communities are not powers that give them the right to decide to be independent. They're not powers that give them any sense of sovereignty whatsoever, and that's the major problem. One of the things that happened in Catalonia recently, which has been so significant in generating support for independence, is that in 2006 they updated their statute of autonomy, so the document that lays out their powers. And the Catalans wanted some fairly major changes to that statute, and they voted on that in the Catalan Parliament, and it was approved by the Catalan Parliament with a great majority. Unfortunately, though, it's not just up to the Catalans, it's up to the Spanish government as well, and the Spanish government insisted on watering down those new powers. It was then put to a vote in Catalonia, and again the Catalan people ratified the statute, but after it had come into force, it was challenged through Spain's constitutional court, and it took them 4 years to make a decision about whether they thought parts of the text were unconstitutional or not. And in 2010, they gave a ruling which said that parts of the statute were unconstitutional and therefore had to be changed. So we have a process from 2006 to 10 whereby the Catalans who had voted on their statute, who had accepted it and started to implement it, were then told that there were some parts of it that they could not take forward. And over that period, this is where we see the beginning of interest in independence for Catalonia. So I just thought I'd start by giving you an idea of the powers that Catalonia does have. This is perhaps the boring bit. but I suppose it's interesting to know in terms of comparisons with what the powers are that the Scottish Parliament has. Basically, there are three types of powers. There are those that are reserved to the Spanish state, those that are shared, and those that are exclusive to Catalonia. So the Spanish state reserves powers in the area of foreign policy, and that includes interactions with the European Union. And the Catalans are always saying that one thing they'd really like is more representation within the European Union as Catalonia, as Catalans. And one of the things they've started to do recently is to have their own shadow diplomatic corps. Even though they have no real powers in those areas, they have started to have offices. There's one in London, for example, one in Brussels, one in New York, where although they don't have any official mandate to have relationships with other countries, they're doing a kind of a diplomacy effort in order to try and make the world aware of the position of Catalonia and what they want to happen. So the Spanish state obviously is not very happy with this, but there's not a lot they can do because all these people are doing is talking to. They're lobbying within the other countries, so they're not actually making any agreements or having any binding relationships with the other countries. So they're not doing anything illegal, but they shouldn't really be there at all. So this shadow diplomatic corps is trying to make up for the fact that Catalonia has no representation within the Spanish state in terms of talking to other countries. We've got economic and monetary policy, which are reserved also to the Spanish state, defence and criminal law. But interestingly, Catalan civil law still exists. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I don't really know the difference between criminal law and civil law, so I had to go and look this up. But civil law is mainly to do with things like inheritance and family law. So there is a tradition of the way that inheritance works, for example, in Catalonia, which is different to other parts of Spain. And so they're very much are now able to choose which way they want to go down. So if you are making a will, you can choose to use Catalan civil law as your guarantor of inheritance, or you can use the Spanish civil law. So there's a choice. But it's something very minor and doesn't affect many people. Criminal law is just the state's responsibility. Then, as I said, there are shared powers. So, for example, in education, the state makes what's called framework legislation. So the state says, this is the kind of education people should receive, and these are the basic provisions that should be guaranteed in every autonomous community. And then the Catalans, along with the other autonomous communities, have the right to fill in the gaps in that. And there's been a lot of conflict in Catalonia over the policy of linguistic immersion. So nowadays in Catalonia, schools teach entirely in Catalan, apart from the 3 or 4 hours a week that people are doing Spanish language and literature. And obviously the Spanish government, especially the current government, which is a right-wing government, is upset by that because they feel that students are not getting enough exposure to Spanish. The argument, of course, is that they get so much exposure to Spanish in the rest of their lives that why would they need any more at school? They come out from school perfectly able to read and write in both languages, so what's the problem? But that's one of the areas where there's been specific conflict over the last couple of years because the Spanish state has been trying to rein in that immersion policy and force Catalan schools to teach more in Spanish. In public order, you've got the sharing of powers as well. So, for example, there is a Catalan police force. They're called the Squaddy Boys, which is quite interesting, the Mossos d'Esquadra, which is a kind of traditional name. I don't think they really thought through that through before they named it. You know, the fact that they're called boys lends to all sorts of ridicule and so on. So they have now quite a lot of responsibility for policing in Catalonia. And in health, you've got shared powers as well, because again, the state sets out minimum standards, but then it's the Catalan government that is in charge of providing that healthcare for the whole of the region. And then finally, there are the things that Catalonia can do without any interference, or technically without any interference. It's interesting, for example, the first one, you've got culture there, but there is still a Ministry of Culture in the Spanish government. So why would you need, if you've got all the autonomous communities looking after culture, why would you need a Ministry of Culture as well? And of course, what the Ministry of Culture for Spain does is to protect the culture of Madrid and of the centre of Spain, whereas the autonomous communities protect their own culture. But again, there's a bit of a strange mixture there. And I've already mentioned language. So the Catalan language is spoken by the vast majority of the 7 and a bit million people who live in Catalonia. They can't all necessarily write it, especially those in the older generations who lived under the Franco regime and weren't taught to write in Catalan. But the younger generations who've been through school can read, write, speak and understand Catalan and Spanish perfectly fine. So it's only the older generations that may not be able to write it. So, as I've said, that is one of the key elements where the Catalan government has been very keen to promote a Catalan identity and to make sure that the Catalan language is not going to die out by making sure that it's taught in the schools as the main language of education. Other areas that they can make legislation in without any interference: regional and local transport, communications, which I'm going to say a bit about later, local government and social welfare. And again, there's been some problems in terms of social welfare, in the sense that, for example, there's a very big immigrant population in Catalonia now, people from Latin America, from North Africa, from Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Catalan government says, well, we have to try and integrate these people, provide their healthcare and education when they get here, but we don't actually have any powers over whether they come to Catalonia or whether they go to Andalusia. We should have some say in the kind of immigrants that we would like to see in our society. So, there's a kind of conflict they reckon between, having to provide for people, and of course Barcelona is a real magnet for immigrants, or has been, not necessarily right now because of Spain's economic crisis, but certainly before that it was. So, the institutions that Catalonia has, which have those powers, the main one is called the Generalitat de Catalunya, the Catalan Generality, and this again is an ancient name. The first Generalitat was in the Middle Ages, and it was something that was revived in the 1930s when there was briefly an autonomous government in Catalonia, and then back again in the 1970s. So that's why it's called by this name. There are other Generalitats. The Generalitat of Valencia, for example, uses the same name. So this is the name that covers the regional parliament and government altogether, is the Generality. It's a single chamber parliament, and it has a president of the Generality, the Generalitat. There's no president of Catalonia. So if you see that in the press, or anybody talks about Artur Mas as the president of Catalonia, that's actually not accurate. He's the president of the Generalitat, not of Catalonia. And that parliament and government have various subsidiary organisations, including an ombudsman and a body that oversees broadcasting in the region. And again, I'm going to say a bit later, again, about communications. Catalonia is divided into 4 provinces, and these provinces are a historical legacy of how Spain was organised in the past. As far as the Catalans are concerned, they'd like to get rid of them. They don't really want to have provinces. They do have their own provincial organisational bodies, but the Catalans do as much as they can to make sure that they're not very important. And the layer that they think is important is what's called the counties, which is something that doesn't exist everywhere in Spain. It's something that the Catalans have wanted to have because it reflects the way that Catalonia was organised before it became part of the Spanish state. So they try and ignore the provinces and concentrate on the smaller units, which are called the counties. And then there's a High Court of Justice, but again, that is only exercising the powers that's given to it by the Spanish state. So they don't have any responsibility for making law in that sense, just for upholding it. In terms of finances, again, this is one of the areas that the Catalans have been complaining about over the last few years, and something I think that's quite relevant to the Scottish case in the sense that there are going to be new taxation powers for the Scottish Parliament coming in, and so to see the comparison is quite interesting. The Catalan Parliament has limited tax collecting powers, and I could run through what they are. There are bits of income tax and so on, but actually it makes no difference because the amount that they collect in taxes is not enough to run the services that they need to run. So the Spanish government then tops up the amount they get to a set amount. So regardless of how much the Catalans collect themselves, they're always dependent on going to the Spanish government and saying, we need more money in order to provide the healthcare and education and so on that you expect us to provide. And this has been, as I say, one of the problems that the Catalans have faced, partly because of the philosophy within Spain that wealth should be redistributed around the whole of Spain. So Catalonia is one of the richer regions, pays more in taxes than it gets back in investment. And the reason for that is that some of its money, some of the money that's collected in Catalonia goes to fund the poorer regions. So Andalusia, Galicia, Extremadura, and so on receive money from this general pot, which is much in excess of what they actually make. So this has come to be viewed by the Catalans as an unjustified fiscal deficit. So the fact that their taxes disappear, if you like, into the rest of Spain without being returned in some way. And they reckon that something like 8 or 9% of their GDP disappears every year. And this has become one of the major grievances in Catalonia. The idea that that they, no matter how hard they work to try and make Catalan industry and business, etc., better, they are never supported in that by the Spanish state, because the Spanish state just takes the money and gives it to somebody else, rather than actually helping them with the infrastructure that they need to conduct business and so on. So this is a quotation from a former leader of the Catalan Republican left, José Luis Carol Rovira, who at one point complained that they were paying Scandinavian taxes but getting Latin American infrastructure. And this is where, again, one of the major grievances has come from. People talk about the Catalan independence movement as being perhaps somewhat a product of the global financial crisis and the way that Spain suffered over the last few years in terms of not being able to improve its economy since the financial crisis. And that's part of it, but part of it actually is more long-standing than that. It's this, there's something they've been aware of since the 90s, the issue of not feeling supported by the state in terms of investment. Okay, so I thought I'd just pick out a couple of areas where Scotland might learn from Catalonia, again, depending on what you wanted to do with that knowledge. And two things that strike me as particularly different, if you like, in the Catalan case from the Scottish case. And one of those is communication. So in Catalonia you have what sociologist Manuel Castells calls parallel networks of communication. So you've got Spanish media, you've got the national broadcasters, the national newspapers, etc. But Catalonia has its own broadcasting and journalistic infrastructure, which operates completely separately. And I think this is one of the big differences from Scotland. If you look at what happened just before the independence vote, where we had a lot of protests about BBC Scotland and how it was, not just BBC Scotland, but BBC as a whole, and how it was portraying the referendum. BBC Scotland is not able to be completely independent from the BBC organisation as a whole. Newspapers are part of larger groups, and therefore they too are influenced by editorial policies that don't necessarily reflect Scottish priorities. Whereas in Catalonia, that's not the case. So there is, for example, a Catalan television channel, TV3, which is very influential in putting forward pro-independence points of view. They've made documentaries about why Catalonia might want to be independent. Their TV news and so on is very much, the editorial line is very much pro-independence. And they also have newspapers in Catalan, like the TV as well, that are able to put forward a pro-independent stance. So whether you think this is good or bad, again, depends on your point of view. The Spanish government really doesn't like it because they claim that the Catalans are being indoctrinated by their media. They claim that support for independence is being whipped up by television and radio and the newspapers in ways that are not reflective of what the Catalans themselves really think. Nevertheless, the Spanish media still dominates in many ways. So the range of publications, for example, the range of different types of whether it's children's books or whether it's TV programs, gossip programs, whatever it is, there's a much wider variety of stuff available in Spanish. So a lot of Catalans will watch stuff in Spanish because they don't have that offer in Catalan. So the Spanish media is still dominant in that way. But as I said, the major thing is that the Catalan media is independent of Spanish institutions and indeed is supported by the Catalan institutions themselves. So TV3 and Ara, the newspaper, are both subsidised by public money. And again, this is something that the Spanish government is not happy about. And why are we allowing public money to go to subsidising TV and programmes and TV stations and newspapers that are then generating support for independence? But the Catalan government has the right to do that if it wants to do that. So this has become a great source of concern for the Spanish government and something else that they've tried to rein in. And for example, there's been some underhand deals about broadcasting licenses where they have cut off particular frequencies by handing that license to somebody else when a Catalan broadcaster was already using it, that kind of thing. So they've been trying dirty tricks as well as protocols. The other thing that you'll notice, I think very much if you've been reading the newspaper reports of what's going on in Catalonia over the last few weeks, is to do with people power. And this is something, again, that is often contrasted with the Scottish situation, simply because of the sheer numbers of people that you see participating in the mass events in Catalonia. So you've got one example here of one of the mass demonstrations that's taken place recently. But there are also some very innovative small-scale events. And as I talk, I'm just going to play a little bit of video here, which is of a flash mob. So this was a flash mob that descended on the Plaza Catalunya, which is the main square in Barcelona, a few years ago now. I think it was 2012, but don't quote me on that. And they made this very professional video of what happened. I'm just going to leave it to play. It's, they're shouting Independencia, which is which is what you shout, basically. Okay, I'm going to turn the sound down because I don't want it to be. I will turn the sound down, but there you go. Right. Hopefully you can still hear me but not hear that. Is that correct? Okay, good. Alright, so as I said, there have been various mass demonstrations. There was one on the 11th of September this year that they reckon probably came close to 2 million people attending. Those figures are always disputed. Everybody thinks that there are fewer or more depending on whether they think they're in favour or not of independence. But there have been a series of these demonstrations since 2010, and normally they happen on the 11th of September because that's Catalonia's National Day. But not always. There was one in 2010 which was to protest against the cuts to the statute that I was talking about. So the Catalans are fantastic at organising these things. They use social media, they are very, very astute about getting large numbers of people organised. So 2013 they did a human chain from the French border in the north to the Valencian border in the south, and that was 400 kilometres. And they reckoned they needed 400,000 people for that, and they ended up getting over 1.5 million. So you know the mobilising power of the movement is absolutely incredible, and the organisational astuteness of the Catalans is incredible. So the last example of that was the vote that took place on the 9th of November, which was supposed to have been a proper binding referendum originally, till the Spanish government said, no, you can't have a proper binding referendum. Then it was supposed to be a proper consultation with the electoral roll being used and so on, and then the Spanish government said, no, you can't do that either, even though that wouldn't have been binding. And so it was the volunteers, it was the civil associations that ended up organising that vote. And despite the fact that it was unofficial, non-binding, and indeed purely symbolic, 2.3 million people turned out to vote. Now obviously, most of those were the people who were in favour of independence. So those who were against independence didn't bother voting because the vote didn't have any legal effect. So, can you hear the Cantos Ocels? Can you hear the music? This is Pablo Casals, or Pau Casals, the famous cellist playing A Song of the Birds, which is one of the Catalan iconic pieces of music. So, the vote, as I said, was organised by the civil associations. It was purely symbolic, but the fact that so many people turned out to vote gives us an indication of how strong the feeling is in Catalonia about wanting the vote. Oops. So I've talked about these smaller events, flashmobs, lip dubs, which is where you have a piece of music and you lip sync to the music. And there was one of those in the town of Beek that drew 5,771 people. So you have a camera that moves between 5,771 people, all lip syncing to a particular song. And that was supposed to be a Guinness World Record, except that there's no such category with the Guinness Book of Records for the largest lip dub. So again, people are really organising, they're really passionate about this. And obviously that is, in many ways, born of the frustration of not being able to vote. So it's not just about wanting independence, it's about not being able to make your voice heard. It's about always being dismissed by the Spanish government as being greedy and selfish and lacking solidarity with the rest of Spain. Yes, Catalans are getting really frustrated at that. But I think one thing that we might want to bear in mind is that this isn't straightforwardly a grassroots movement. If by grassroots movement you talk about people who are not normally politically mobilised, people who have felt disenfranchised, I mean that's what we saw here at the end of the independence referendum period here. We saw people coming out onto the streets and getting involved who would not generally feel that they were interested in politics or wanted to have anything to do with it. This is not really the same, what's going on in Catalonia. It's actually a very middle class thing. And a lot of it is led by the cultural elites. So you guys have mentioned journalism, I've mentioned the TV and so on. A lot of it is being led by people who are linked to the media and to culture in some way. And it's the middle classes who are saying, well, we used to think we would be better off staying in Spain, and now we think actually we'd be better off independent. So it's not straightforwardly a grassroots movement. So finally, I thought I'd just say a little bit about the comparison really between what here has come to be known as Duo Max and what in Catalonia is being known as the third way. The problem in Catalonia is that nobody actually knows what third way means. It could, to some people, mean federalism, or to other people it means more autonomy. But there isn't currently a political party that properly represents that option. So one of the issues within Catalonia is because there has been no proper referendum, there has also been no proper Better Together campaign, and therefore people are not able to express alternatives in the way that they ought to be able to do. But there is this kind of vague idea that there might be a third way, whatever that is. So one of the ways that people talk about that Catalonia could remain with Spain, but could be better off, would be to have what would be called an economic accord. And this is something the Basque country actually already has through a quirk of history. So the Basques actually collect all their own taxes and then they pay a proportion to Madrid for services. So it's a completely different arrangement from what Catalonia has. As I said, Catalonia never can collect enough taxes because it's not allowed to fund what it needs to do, and therefore it's always dependent on the Spanish state giving it more money. The Basques keep their money apart from a small amount which is paid for defence and international relations and all those things that the state does. So the Catalans say, well, why can't we have that? And the answer seems to be that actually the Spanish government would like to take it away from the Basques if they could, let alone give it to the Catalans. So that's not going to happen anytime soon. But of course, for the Catalans, again, one of the richer regions of Spain, like the Basque country, it would be enormously beneficial to them to have this way of keeping their own revenues and then investing in what they wanted to do. The other thing that might be possible would be for the Catalans to have more influence within the Spanish parliament. And one of the complaints is that Catalans are never given the top jobs. There's never a Catalan prime minister. They're always sidelined. The voice of Catalonia is always sidelined within national debate. So one way of dealing with that would be to reform Spain's upper house, the Senate. And there are various examples around the world of countries that have a Senate that represents the region. So Germany, for example, has the Bundesrat, which is the upper house where the Länder, the states of Germany, send representatives to that state, to that Senate that represent their state. Australia has the same kind of system. So it would be possible to reform the Senate so that rather than just being individual representatives, if you like, these were regional representatives. Again, there's no will from the Spanish government to do that at all. The other thing that might be possible would be to have some form of federalism like Germany's federalism. And a lot of people talk about Catalonia as if it was already federal, which it isn't. Catalan regions have a lot of power, but there's no power sharing at the centre. And most federal countries would have this combination. So it's not just about saying, here are your powers, go away and do it. It's also about saying, and then you can represent your point of view in the central government as well. That's the bit that's missing. So some form of federalism might work, but the Catalans and the Basques, and to some extent the Galicians over on the western corner, always feel that they are different from the other regions of Spain. They have their own languages, their own long histories of independence and different cultures and so on. So what they would much prefer, I think, is a form of asymmetrical federalism. So instead of being like Germany, where all of the states have more or less the same powers, you would have a system where the Catalans, the Basques, and the the Galicians. So I was thinking, it's very similar actually to the UK system. We're talking about something that's actually very similar to what we have in the UK. So Scotland has more powers than Welsh, for example. So that's something like that would work probably better in Spain because it would recognise the differences of the different areas. And the Galicians are very like the Welsh, you're not surprised. It's the mountains. So, my final point is that Catalonia has been looking very enviously on what's been going on in Scotland. I was interviewed for a radio programme on the day of the referendum in Edinburgh, and this was the Catalan morning radio show, and Edinburgh was crawling with Catalans, all wearing their yes badges, completely ineligible to vote, but still wearing their yes badges, and really, really, really being enthusiastic. And of course the thing that they were most enthusiastic about was the fact that there was a referendum. And in some senses they're holding David Cameron as a kind of saint. And I made the point on the programme that if he had realised when he allowed the referendum how close the result would have been, he perhaps would have thought twice about it. But anyway, they're thinking of him as a representative of true democracy because he allowed the vote. And they just wish that the Spanish Prime Minister Rajoy would do the same thing. Rajoy has no intention of doing anything like that, and it's been announced just in the last couple of days that the president of the Catalan Generalitat is going to be arrested and charged with organising the unofficial vote on the 9th of November. So not only does the Spanish Prime Minister not wish a referendum to take place, he's also going to insist that Autonomy, the president of the Catalan government, is charged with breaking the law for organising the vote on the 9th of November. So Catalonia would love to have the same recognition as a nation that Scotland has, recognition of its right to decide, recognition of its sovereignty, and even something simple like having its own football team. I know, they look at Scotland and Wales and they say, how is it that they have their own football team, we're not allowed to have one? How is it that there's a recognition that these are nations and there is no recognition that Catalonia is a nation? So the Catalans are very interested in what's going on in Scotland, and the fact that there was a no vote isn't really an issue, because for them the issue is we were allowed to vote and they're not allowed to vote, and that's their big concern. So I'll stop there and just ask for any questions.
Only comment I make, it's all very well for the Catalans to want their own football team, but they've got good football players.
Well, a lot of people consider about which league they'd actually play if they became independent, because there's no point in Barcelona playing in a Catalan league, because it would never get the... So they reckon they should go and play the Italian league instead.
I know nothing about the history of Catalonia. Was it once like Scotland, an independent country? When did it become part of Spain and why?
Okay, long story, which I will try and be very concise about. So the question is, what's the history of Catalonia? Was it like Scotland, an independent country? The date actually when it became fully integrated into the rest of Spain is very similar to the date that Scotland became united with the rest of the United Kingdom. So for them it's 1714 is the key date. So Catalonia had developed as an autonomous area in the 8th or 9th centuries. Too complicated to go into how and why, but by about the 9th century Catalonia was distinctive, if you like, and that's when the Catalan language started to develop as well, as Latin broke down into the vernacular of that region. Over the centuries there were lots of dynastic unions. So first of all it united with the Kingdom of Aragon, and then it ended up sharing the same monarch as the Kingdom of Castile, but not being part of the Kingdom of Castile. So you imagine Spain, kind of gradually moulding together in different ways, and the Catalans were part of that. But throughout it, they always kept their distinctive identity. They kept their language, their laws, their customs, their parliament, the Generalitat, right up till 1714. What happened in 1714 was that there was a siege of Barcelona because the Catalans had backed the wrong horse, as it were, in the War of the Spanish Succession. So their guy lost. Barcelona was under siege and was captured and conquered at that time. And so at that point, it lost its individual institutions. So yeah, I mean, it's as distinctive, it's a different trajectory from what Scotland went through, but it's as distinctive and as much of a claim to nationhood as Scotland has.
Except they could possibly claim to have been colonised.
Well, that's an yes, they do talk about colonisation. I mean, of course, the Spanish would never see it as colonisation. They simply wouldn't. But they would say that no, actually, Catalonia was part of of Spain from the late 15th century, and what are they talking about 1714 for? Because it was already a part of Spain. Well, yes, it was a part of Spain, but it had its own autonomy within that, and it just happened to share the same monarch. So there are Catalans who think of it as being colonised, but that idea would never be acceptable to other Spaniards.
What do you think would happen here if there was an independence referendum and the result was as the people of Scotland decided to remain part of the UK quite decisively? Do you think they'd be quite upset?
The Catalans would be upset. But
the result of the referendum was no, that's the fact.
Yes.
And, what would happen if they had a referendum in Catalonia and it was the same result?
Yeah, I don't know. My crystal ball doesn't really function when it comes to Catalonia, I'm afraid. It's very hard to know, but I mean, I think there is such a pressure for independence in Catalonia, and it is so much the majority voice. It may not actually be the majority opinion, but it is the majority voice in Catalonia at the moment. So I think if there had been a referendum, a legitimate one, and it had been a no, that would definitely not have been the end of the story. I think that there wouldn't have been any sense of closure, if you like, as a result of that. So imagine that the one on the 9th of November had been a binding referendum, and that the result of that had been no. I simply can't see all the civil associations and the political parties giving up, going home, putting away their flags and saying, okay, fair enough. That wouldn't have happened.
So the Democrats would suit them?
Well, I suppose it depends on your point of view as to whether,
The Democrats would suit them.
Well, in some ways, yes, but then democracy evolves, and it's a question of do you believe it should be a once and for all decision, or do you believe there should be? That's an individual. An individual point of view, whether you believe that something like that is forever, or whether you believe that, democracy evolves and says, say an individual point of view.
I think in your initial title there was some hint to the question whether Scotland had anything to learn from Catalonia. You give me the impression that Catalonia had not learned from Scotland, at least very envious of Scotland.
Yes.
Do you actually think there is much that Scotland can learn?
Well, I think there are definitely parallels, for example, within the European Union, and the way that that these small nations or stateless nations are represented within the European Union, and as one gets more power within its own territory, that also becomes a question for the European Union. So whether it's Scotland and Catalonia, or Flanders, or the Basque Country, or whatever, there's a general movement, I think, to put pressure on the European Union to recognise these stateless nations in ways that they haven't been recognised before. And the Catalans, for example, are very good at lobbying in Brussels. And I don't know enough about, I've only been in Scotland a couple of years, I don't know enough about Scotland to know how good the Scots are at lobbying in Brussels. But that might be something that that could be thought about, in terms of learning from Catalonia, the idea that you need to have a voice within the European Union, and that the European Union needs to stop thinking entirely in terms of nation states and actually represent the stateless nations as well. So that might be one thing. And as I say, again, whether Scotland can learn from Catalonia partly depends on what you want Scotland to do. There are people who say that Scotland should learn from Catalonia's people power and should be trying to emulate the civil movement in Catalonia. There are people who say that Scotland should emulate Catalonia's media system, and that the Scottish Parliament should start subsidising newspapers and so on, and creating an independent media system. So again, it depends a bit what you want to do. And if Catalan autonomy does evolve, if there is some form of concession, then it would be interesting to see how that evolves, and whether Scotland might take some lessons from that in terms of, what kind of powers the Catalans might get, and whether they would also be good for Scotland. So, I think the problem with answering the question is, as I say, it depends on what you want as to what lessons you can take.
You missed out on the one uniting thing you can learn from Catalonia, which would of course be football.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I was just wondering about the grassroots movement there, Kathryn, because on the one hand I think a lot of the movement for independence in Scotland was about people wanting political change, and that just happened to seemed to be the most immediate way of bringing that about. Whereas some of what you're hearing about Catalonia is either independence for independence sake, or else it's linked to, I'm just wondering how the left feels about that in Catalonia, where actually it's about keeping their own taxes, they're the wealthiest, and it is about keeping wealth, whereas the distributive qualities of the nation state are putting it to people that are not so better off, or that's what they're saying they're doing anyway. How does that notion, I would say the left in Scotland want independence because I think that's the best way to bring about something more looking something socialist, whereas the independence of Catalonia seems to be going against that in terms of what people are asking for.
Yeah, well, there are two main forces in the pro-independence camp in Catalonia. One is the current government, the CiU and Autonomy, and they're more kind of centre-right, and they're much more the party of business and of trying to think about economic reasons for independence in that sense. Then there's the Catalan Republican left. And as you can tell from the title of the party, they've got a different agenda. They've got a social democrat agenda, and a lot of what they're talking about is about people being better off, but not in the same way, not in the way of supporting businesses and so on, but actually being able to have more just and equal policies of social welfare and those kinds of things. So that there are the two different forces. At the moment, they're both pushing in the same direction because both of them want independence for slightly different reasons. There is definitely within the civil movement a feeling of the need for people's voices to be heard. In a way that the Spanish government isn't currently allowing to happen. So there's a sense that Spain is not a true democracy, and that the Spanish government at this time is trying to keep people in their place and stop them from expressing certain kinds of opinion and so on. So within the civil movement there are, again, a combination of views, but a lot of it is about a frustration at the Spanish government and not feeling that they can live as Catalans and be accepted as part of the Spanish state. So it's not so much about the economy in that sense. But yeah, there are some things where the pro-independence movement is quite similar to some of the things you were talking about for Scotland. People actually feeling political change is necessary. Spain is a real in a real mess, not just economically but also politically at the moment. And you've got a new force that's come to the fore called Podemos, We Can, which is a kind of grassroots movement that now they reckon will probably win about 20% of seats if there was a general election in Spain, coming from nowhere. So there's a lot of discontent about Spanish democracy and the economy as a whole, and one of the ways that that's being channeled in Catalonia is into independence.
What is it they're saying that they can do?
They can govern the country a lot better than the political parties, is what they're saying.
I was interested to know what the debate was within Spain with regard to its constitution and its current governance. Whether there is a body of people who are saying we need to review the whole constitution.
There is, and Podemos would be one of them. But the problem is that a bit like here again, the institutional, the party that up till now has been the representative of that view, the Socialist Party, has sunk. Its support has plummeted over the last few years. It's got no real alternative to offer to what's going on, and people are looking for other forces like Podemos. So you've got the Popular Party, badly named, in power at the moment, which is the right-wing party that is causing all this conflict with Catalonia because of its refusal to listen. And then you've got a socialist party that should be the alternative to that, but is dying. And then all these different forces like Podemos and other smaller parties that are beginning to come out. What will happen in the next Spanish general election next year is anybody's guess, because it's likely to be a very mixed vote. So you're going to get small parties with a lot more representation than they had before, and somebody is going to have to be able to form a government out of all that. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. There was a question at the back there.
I just wondered if there are some areas of Catalonia that are more pro-independence than others. Like, I'm thinking, am I right in thinking, like, the Balearics, like at Mallorca, is Catalan?
They're Catalan speakers, but
I never see so much feeling about pro-independence of Catalonia.
no, it's a really interesting question actually, because the bit that I've been talking about is the autonomous community of Catalonia, which is the bit around Barcelona, goes from the French border down to the Valencian border and then across to Aragon. But there are people in Valencia who speak Catalan, there are people in the Balearic Islands who speak Catalan, but they're not in the same autonomous community. And their relationship with Catalonia is very ambivalent. So they don't necessarily want to join Catalonia and be independent, because there's always been a kind of a tense relationship between those different Catalan-speaking areas. But within Catalonia itself, there are some areas that are more pro-independence than others as well. So the north, for example, around Girona and the Pyrenees and so on, would be much more pro-independence than Barcelona, the city, because Barcelona, of course, is made up of a wide range of immigrants and temporary residents and people from the rest of Spain and so on. So, you can see that in voting, for example, on the 9th of November. Liam, are we...
I'm just thinking I should thank Kathryn.
I think
that's a good one.
you're hovering.
No, I'm just checking for people coming to go. Can we thank Kathryn very much?